tech used to be the symbol of everything good, right? We were going to use tech for the benefit of humanity, but I started
The New
seeing
York Times reported this week that the Biden campaign already has raised $1.1 billion. They're going to use it to try to keep other people off the ballot.
and you've called people out, and you have been very, very accurate in your assessment of what went wrong and why. There's no interest right now within the party on actual solutions. How are you doing?
I am great. More to the point, how are you?
It's been 3 weeks and 3 days since the announcement, and it's been wonderful. I am so proud to be part of this ticket, proud to be supporting you, proud of all the people who are working on this, aligned around this vision for a healthy America, that we can finally move past the chaos of the last 10 years. That there's hope for a new model for peace within this country and prosperity, and a new model for peace and prosperity abroad as well. And an end to using the political system in ways that it wasn't intended to be used.
I mentioned to you because we had lunch before this podcast, but I think about you all the time about the impact of this on you because most people who go into politics, even though I did not intend to run for president, I've spent my life thinking about politics and kind of understanding it and working in campaigns, and and also understanding, over the past 16 years how some of these issues turn your best friends against you and, cause all these kind of personal disruptions in your life. And I think about you and think, I had essentially 6 years of preparation for this, even longer, because my first convention was when I was 6 years old at the Democratic National Convention, and I've been thinking about politics my whole life. But what would it be like for somebody who, had 1 week to think about this decision and then was plunged into this incredible, just cascade of turbulence and, hope, for embodying so much hope for so many people as you do, but also becomes the flashpoint for anger and resentment and bitterness, and then the friends who you lose, and the political alliances, and what's that been like for you from a personal standpoint?
Overall, it's been really interesting because I mean, look at the news. Puck News just put out yesterday an article called "The Shanahan Persuasion Campaign," and it outlines all the ways the DNC and people very close to me over the years have been trying to persuade me to step down from running on this ticket with you. And my experience has been 90% very positive. And again, this is one of these other signals. I've been talking about all of these signals about support, or silent signals and pockets of support around the country for your campaign. And that's been my experience too. Abundantly positive. And then there's about this 10% of folks that are still tied to this narrative of you have to spit hate at the other because that's how politics is done. And that 10% is super loud. They're really, really loud. And they have a strategy to them that reminds me more of being bullied in high school than it does of the sportsmanship you would expect of our political system.
That's a great word to use, sportsmanship, because there's another word that traditionally was used, and it was called comedy, which is comity, which is kind of a level of dignity, a kind of a baseline of respect that you give your opponent,
Yeah.
which seems to be completely gone. And Liz Smith, who's kind of this, I don't know if I probably shouldn't call her a harpy, but that's kind of what her, my son Connor worked for Pete Buttigieg's campaign, and she was, one of the bosses, and he said that she's like, yeah, like the Darth Vader of dark politics in this country. That she's kind of an alchemist for bitterness and demonizing and vilifying people, and she's now made you her target.
Apparently, if you read this article from the Puck, they have whole pockets of people coming together to target, you know, me specifically. And they're looking at two options: drop a nuclear bomb on her and let's just be as cruel as possible. And then there's this other pocket of people that I've worked with over the years, and they're offering me an off ramp. Like a gentle off ramp. And I look at both options and I think to myself, it's really ironic that they're claiming the only reason I've joined this ticket is for my money. And my response is the point of wealth is to help those in the world. And I think there's great need in America right now. And I think that your campaign represents the solution. But what's also ironic about that claim of theirs is that, to my sole experience over the last 5-6 years with the Democratic Party was only interest in my money. Offering
That's a good
150
point.
offering $150,000 car rides with President Obama. I haven't had a real conversation with the leadership of the Democratic Party in many, many years, to the extent where I did want to support the DNC to run fair primaries. And, I asked all of my closest friends and people within the party, how do we do this? Let's get this done. Let's fix and reform the DNC. Each and every time I got routed to campaign finance for Biden. Every single time I was put on the phone call with somebody who was selling me one thing or another, a dinner party or an event, but none of it was about environmental health. None of it was about the things I care about. None of it was about issues on the economy. None of it was solutions oriented. None of it was even about what my background is, which is, AI and the innovation economy. There's no interest right now within the party on actual solutions. And I keep hearing this from, across the political spectrum here in California, is that there's these exchanges that are being made for power, and those exchanges aren't in the best interests of the constituents or the people. Again, very ironic that one of the strongest narratives they have right now is that my involvement is solely due for cash. That's been the only experience I've had with the Democratic Party. They just want my money. So,
Well, that and yeah, so now you're a mercenary because you're selling yourself for money. But and you and I we were talking this morning. Today is kind of an interesting day because there was a press conference in Pennsylvania
yeah.
where 5 members of my family endorsed President Biden, and it's part of an orchestrated campaign that we were talking about by the DNC. I had Cesar Chavez's family come out last week against me, which is bracing because my whole life I had this me and my family this relationship with a special relationship with Cesar Chavez, and I worked personally with him for many, many years on pesticide issues, but also on elections. And with members of the family, Dolores Huerta, somebody that I grew up with, that was my hero, that was my personal friend. I had tomorrow, I'm told, 50 plus environmental leaders, including 3 former executive directors of NRDC, the organization that I spent almost 40 years at, are going to come out demanding that I step down, that I leave the race.
Yeah.
And then, you and I were talking about what we also had this situation this week where we have an attorney that works for our campaign, a brilliant attorney called Paul Rossi, who is, and he's a single practitioner, but he does election law and he's really good at it. And he's won a whole series. The DNC is attacking us in every state, trying to disqualify our ballot signatures and using all kinds of underhanded and scurrilous methods that they know are not kosher. And Paul Rossi has gone up each time and won every case. So last Friday, the DNC attorneys called him and offered him $1 million to come work for their firm and to promise him that they were going to give him Supreme Court cases and that they wanted to make him a superstar. We're seeing this all over. I told you that I read yesterday an article that Robert Reich sent out. Robert Reich's the economist. He was an advisor to my father. He was, he's a guy that I've worked with my whole life. And that he did this article saying, RFK Jr. is no RFK, and then repeating all of these, I'm anti-vax that I supposedly said the Jews caused the COVID epidemic, and and all of these things that, of course, I never said, but have been attributed to me at various times. And you were telling me about your kind of dispiriting similar experience with James Carville.
Oh, yes, James Carville. So I was a huge James Carville fan as a young woman in high school and college. I saved up all of my money one summer to go and watch a show that James Carville was in with Tucker Carlson, where they debated one another on stage on political issues, called Crossfire. And so I was really saddened and really quite offended when I heard that James Carville very publicly has been going around trying to dig up personal dirt on my life and spread gossipy rumors to discredit my ability to do this job. And it's just remarkable that we are now in a political system that in which sportsmanship has evaporated so much that these strategies remind me more of Mean Girls in high school than they do constructive democracy, right? And I think that's the heart of what this campaign is. I oftentimes tell people, I think this might be the greatest exercise in American democracy this country has ever seen. And even if you think about the path towards success, because there is a very, very clear path if you look at the way that our founding fathers structured our system of elections. Even if no single candidate gets to 270 electoral college votes, there's this other path within Congress. And one of the biggest debates I hear today is that, well, we don't have a parliamentary system, thus there's no space to have a third-party candidate. And if you look at all great democracies around the world, there's often three parties. Canada is a three-party system. The UK has multiple parties. It's not a duopoly.
There are multiple parties.
Yeah, there are multiple parties, and they all have a voice and they have a shot. And as America is maturing, it's very natural that we are in this moment in history right now. Very, very natural, and it's actually the only way forward. And so when you look at how Congress is designed to act, Congress between the House and the Senate.
You're talking about it in a contingency election.
In a contingency election. So what that means is no one presidential candidate gets to 270 electoral college votes, which is required to win the presidency in a public election. What happens next is that this vote then goes to Congress. And in that moment, the House would vote between you, President Trump, or President Biden. And that's a moment in which Congress starts to look more like a parliament, right? It's almost like this quasi parliamentary representative system, where the House gets together, they represent their districts, and then they decide who becomes the next president. As I look at this model, I think this is a very good thing. I think that this is a very good course correction for the future of this country, where we are able to change this structure of and this intensity of hate of the other around. And we realize that we live in this wonderful democracy that was designed specifically to perform in moments like this.
Let me ask you, and I think the way you said that is really interesting, and I hadn't thought about it that way as a metaphor for the parliamentary system. That we actually do have a multi-party system in this country, and but it's different than the parliamentary system, but it provides the same mechanism for electing a third-party candidate who's not part of that duopoly. Let me ask you kind of a different question, which is how do you personally internalize that when you're being, attacked from all these people who were once your friends, your heroes? How have you been weathering that? And how do you view it? How do you look at it, in terms of your place in life, etc.?
I had such an deep awakening over the last 2 years. The pandemic impacted me in significant ways, and I think I speak for a huge part of the population when I say I trusted the system to look out for my well-being and my family's well-being and the well-being of my community and the well-being of communities across America. And like many, I believe that we were wronged and we were deeply hurt, and we're still recovering from that. When people say that this is a one issue platform around, health and well-being, I say, but let's unpack that issue because yes, there's this whole desire for medical freedom and informed consent, but what are we really talking about? We're talking about the very fact that censorship has occurred. Our first most important freedom in this country is freedom of speech. We're talking about the right for babies to have every opportunity to a healthy life in this country, fundamental to just our basic understanding of human rights. So when I get attacked by people that I still hold very dear, whose opinion I respect immensely, and when I get attacked publicly for being a part of this, I remind myself that I am aligned with a responsibility for everything I've gotten from being an American to make sure that that America is still available for the next generation. I am operating from a place of duty, and that is unshakable. Your desire to work on behalf of a greater power, which is what, your uncle and your father represented for this country, knowing that from a place of privilege, one must go above and beyond to protect those freedoms that gave you those opportunities. And I'm like first generation American. Immigrants who have gotten here and worked their butt off, they know how precious those rights are. I know how precious those rights are. So it is worth it to put everything I have into ensuring that in this very, very special moment in history, I stand up and do the right thing. all the other stuff is noise. And I think about it the same way that I think about, incentive structures. I mean, the amount of money, these parties have today is so enormous. Like, this is the ultimate underdog campaign. It's really being scrapped together. And, but what makes it viable in today's environment is that there's no amount of money that can cover up some of the harms that have been caused by this duopoly and by the continuation of it. Looking at our $34 trillion deficit, we have to address it. There's no way out of this mess than just going through it with all of the smartest, brightest people around us. And that's what this campaign's attracting. The misconception I think about this campaign is that it's a ragtag team that is, winging it, and that there's no real substance of professionals supporting it. But that is not the case, right? Some of the smartest people from finance are part of this campaign. Some of the brightest economists are part of this campaign. Some of the brightest environmentalists are part of this campaign. And these are the environmentalists that aren't looking to geoengineering to solve our problems, but they're environmentalists who understand the deep complexity of how nature works. So, to answer your question, I think that I don't feel at all like I'm putting my neck out there. I think that I'm stepping side by side and arm to arm with a movement of incredibly smart, skilled people who really, really, really want to seize this moment to course correct the path that we are on in this country.
I think that's what I thought that you would. You have you've a heroic approach to life, and I wondered how you're coping with this because it really is kind of overwhelming. And the New York Times reported this week that the Biden campaign already has raised $1.1 billion, which is more than any campaign in history, and that they're on track to raise $3 billion. And they're not going to use that money to amplify President Biden's voice. They're going to use it to try to keep other people off the ballot or to jail his competitors. And by the way, I'm not a fan of Donald Trump's. I'm running against him. But I want to win this. I want us to win this campaign on a level playing field where Americans get to choose who they want. And if they want to choose somebody who's in prison, they can do that because we're America. And we don't fix elections. We don't rig them. We don't throw people off the ballot. We trust our country. We trust democracy to land us, even if we don't like the candidates, we play fair.
We play fair.
Yeah, and I know that you're idealistic about this country. I know that you love this country, and are, I'm so happy that you're prepared to make that sacrifice. Somebody asked me, Glenn Beck asked me, I was in Texas yesterday, and he asked me, how I weather these things, how I internalize it. And I said to him that every person that I've admired throughout my life in reading history and reading the lives of the saints and reading, my father, who was a great military historian who lectured us who took us to all the great battlefields of the Civil War, the Revolution, who talked to us at night about the Peloponnesian Wars and, the battles that changed history and the leaders that changed history. Every person that I've admired in my lifetime has gone through some kind of, a dark night of the soul where they're alone, where they're isolated, where the world turns against them, where their friends betray them and turn against them. And that I've always understood that that's part of achieving something that's worthwhile. If it's easy, everybody would be doing it, and it wouldn't be meaningful. The things that are meaningful are the things that you have to fight for, that you have to endure hardship and deprivation and betrayal and denunciation of society. And, whether it's scientists or the great explorers, all of them did that. I remember reading the Bhagavad Gita, where one of the great sort of heroes of that, which is it's the great Bible, the great book of Hinduism. One of the heroes is Arjuna, and at the centerpiece of the book is a great battle between these, a great civil war that takes place in what we now call India. And Arjuna is kind of the warrior prince on one side, and he discovers as he walks the battlefield that all his relatives are on the other side, his aunts, his uncles, his cousins, his brothers. And his charioteer is the god Krishna, who's disguised as a human, but who always gives him wise counsel. And Arjuna says to Krishna, I can't fight this war. I can't fight against my own family. It would be morally wrong to do that. And Krishna says to him at one point, everybody here is already dead. I've killed them all. And he said, your job is your dharma. In other words, your duty, which is the word you use, is to engage in battle. You are a warrior. You are here, put here to fight, and to fight for things that you believe in, and you know what's right in this case. You have to fight about it no matter what the consequences. And we all know, that a lot of times we make decisions in life that hurt people that we love, but it doesn't mean they're the wrong decisions. A lot of times you make the correct decision, and it's harmful to people, it's hurtful, it's painful. But once you decide what the right course is,
Yeah.
then the only question is, do you have the strength and the fortitude and the, determination to do that? And I'm so happy to be in the foxhole with you, Nicole, because I've seen your courage from the very beginning, that all of these forces that are now $3 billion worth of money that is available to persuade you to abandon this course. And it doesn't seem to even occur to you to do that.
The thing that I've been trying to make clear is that even before I found your campaign, I had begun the process of abandoning a cultural system that puts profits over people. I had been in Silicon Valley since 2010 working, and I've been working in tech since 2005. And tech used to be the symbol of everything good, right? We were going to use tech for the benefit of humanity. It would be so egalitarian.
To democratize
It would
information.
democratize information. It was such a powerful tool. It was a powerful tool in my life. It was how I figured out how to apply to colleges, and I could do it all by myself on the internet. And I didn't need a parent guiding me or a mentor guiding me. I could do it independently. So that sense of agency was so powerful. And then, something happened. I can't tell you precisely the moment, but I started seeing tech become the symbol of insane power and wealth and ego. And I could see the leadership of tech pulling further and further and further away
from the ideals. Because we were all sold on this. Mark Zuckerberg promised that it would be the agency, the instrument of peace, of democracy, of
discourse,
effectiveness, discourse,
freedom of
everything,
speech.
freedom and empowerment of poor communities and everybody else. And then we, woke up one day, particularly during COVID, and it had become the instrument for totalitarian control, this very kind of dark force and
Yeah.
metamorphosized in front of us. And we're like, holy cow, this is like, it's like a mythology when the beautiful woman turns into a monster, right when you're kissing her.
Right. And I socially was embedded in that whole world, right? Like I socially was, being invited to the big parties, which was this immersion of like very powerful figures like Jeffrey Katzenberg in Hollywood meshing with, all of the tech leadership in the area, and it became culturally very, very different than the, you know tech world that I came up in. The tech world that I came up in was, 5 or 6 people with their computers sitting in a room dreaming about a better future and working super hard to construct these systems that would
And
reduce.
creating companies in garages and,
Yes.
yeah, kids who just graduated high school and, in this beautiful, beautiful, entrepreneurial and democratizing force.
Yeah. And I woke up one day and that was not where I was anymore. I woke up one day and I saw more interest in yachts and party invites and, um, profitable venture capital portfolios. And quite frankly, I grew disgusted with it all. And, at the same time, I had realized my daughter was special needs and was suffering from all kinds of chronic illnesses. And I started putting two and two together. And I started realizing that, like, the environment as well that we've created through tech and engineering, which was based, I believe, originally on good intent, had actually produced an environment that was making people unwell. Um, and so that realization, paired with the fact that noticing that the culture of tech and innovation had been gutted, um, and had become really a culture of power and glamour, it changed my entire life. So when I think about my dark moment, that moment of the soul and the spirit and that aloneness, it was actually that. So I coming into this role wasn't as big of a jump because I had actually dealt with most of the pain of detaching myself from that community about 2 years ago. Um, it was, I lost many people that I thought were my friends. When I turned my back on wanting to participate in that world, it was, people thought I was crazy. Why would you turn your back on, you know, trips to Paris Fashion Week and all the things that they, that come with that kind of wealth? I turned my back on it and I started wearing Birkenstocks and tie dye again and got back to working with my hands in the soil and doing it myself, right? Going back to not hypothesizing about how to make the world a better place from an ivory tower, which is what philanthropy has become. It's very disconnected from people. I want to go back to the people where I started. I started, low income in Oakland, wondering, how to get by day to day, dealing with a lot of the social ills of, domestic violence and violence in my community, violence against women and children, the realities of poverty. I realize it's very, very hard to effectuate any real positive social change when you're sitting in a boardroom in an ivory tower surrounded by wealthy people who have never lived that experience. So I had a big, painful learning experience as I was kind of coming out of a gilded lifestyle, which didn't feel very full of heart and spirit at all. So now stepping into this role, and even before you invited me to join you on the ticket, I had already said goodbye to most of that stuff. I had said, and people ask me about the World Economic Forum. I went once. Had you ever been to
No,
this conference? You haven't.
no.
It's bizarre. I went once in 2017. My ex-husband was invited to speak with Klaus on AI, and I flew out to Davos with him. Was invited to all of the big dinners and these glamorous events, and there were celebrities. And on the surface, it looked like, this is great. We're trying to figure out how to bring peace to the Middle East. I went to a conference on music in Afghanistan, and these programs on their face looked very positive. Socially, though, walking around in the most exclusive rooms, you get this sense of something's not right here. The way that people are engaging with one another isn't based on like a deep personal connection of like, I hear you, I know your story, I respect you. This is, deeply about how we combine our gifts as individuals to make this world a better place. It didn't feel like that at all. It felt like leverage. How do I use leverage to get this, to get that? And that energy of, exchanging what is a human experience for leverage and power, which is a construct, didn't sit right with me, because that exchange, if you think about it just spiritually, for example, doesn't result in the kind of sustainable, benefit of all, constructive deal making, right? It results in short-term gains of here's leverage for leverage. So I think when we talk about like the spirit of this movement, the spirit of like how we get out of this mess of short-term gains of leverage for leverage, we have to go back to what is really at its most simplest form, the basic needs of the human and the spirit and the mind, right? Like this trifecta of our being. Have you at all, Bobby, noticed that in your time watching politics over the years? How did we get so far from caring about American values? Has it just been this incremental exchange of leverage for more power and money, or is there something? Am I missing something? Is it as simple as that, or because the return to going back to our roots and our values in America is going to force us to remember how much we've lost as well.
Yeah, my sort of, I feel like I had a front row view on that devolution of values, and it occurred to me through the steady erosion of the institutions of government and the institutions of democracy, the press, the courts, the regulatory institutions, the courts less than the other ones, but the courts were deeply affected too. Congress, the presidency, the political parties, which all essentially became the instruments of corporate control. And, there were a couple of milestones that you can look at. One would be the Citizens United case in 2008, which was a case, we did lose our democracy earlier on in American history in the 1880s and 1890s during a period that is called the Gilded Age, because it was a period when our country came under the control of a gilded class. The Rockefeller, what we call the robber barons today, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Fricks, the Whitneys, and the Morgans, a few other families that controlled most of American business through interlocking boards that control these big trusts, the Sugar Trust, the Steel Trust, the Oil Trust, and so on. And they were able, this was a period of time when there was no direct election of senators in our country. So the voters did not vote for the senators. The senators were chosen by the state legislatures, and the state legislatures were completely controlled. It was very easy to buy a state legislature at that time, and that was the whole purpose of joining the state legislature was either through raw political ambition because you thought you were going to be president one day, or it was because you could make money there. And so, it was said of the Pennsylvania state legislature that it was the only legislature that was not for sale because John D. Rockefeller owned it and he was not selling any part of it. But all of these legislatures were owned by these big robber barons and these corporate trusts, and they were picking the senators, and they were, writing the legislation, and they were protecting their interests, and they were ultimately picking the president because they control the political parties. And then you had this confluence of events, which gives me hope today, because we did restore democracy in this country. And a couple of things happened. One, we had a couple of magazines, McClure's, and that began publishing the works of this new class of journalists called muckrakers, muckraking journalists, who were going after the robber barons, who were writing exposés about John D. Rockefeller and the Whitneys. Ida Tarbell was one, Upton Sinclair, Sinclair Lewis, many, many others who were read by everybody in the country, and it had this tremendous impact. And then you had a reform movement in the cities within the Republican Party, the moderate Republicans called progressives. And in the countryside, they unified with a movement of Democrats in the countryside called Populists, which was an agrarian movement to restore democracy. And then you had one leader who came along, Teddy Roosevelt, who was part of the oligarchy. But he also had this rebellious nature that said he was not going to be controlled about it. He had ideals, very idealistic about American democracy, at least domestically. And he became president. We passed all of these extraordinary laws that restored democracy. We passed the 40-hour work week. We gave women the vote. We banned child labor. We made it legal for unions to organize. We passed the Sherman Antitrust Act and broke up the Standard Oil Company, which was the biggest monopoly in the world. And in 1908, they passed the most important law, which was a law that made it illegal for corporations to donate to federal political candidates.
Yeah.
And that law lasted for exactly 100 years. And then it was thrown out by the Citizens United case, where this very business-oriented Supreme Court said that no, it's illegal. A donation to a political candidate is a form of free speech, and therefore it's protected by the First Amendment of the Constitution, and you cannot legislate against it. And that, launched this tsunami of money, which we now see President Biden with $3 billion. And it gave control of our government to the moneyed classes, not, the Congress, the House, and it accelerated this devolution toward corporate control. So, and particularly in the agencies, the big industries have been struggling to control the agencies since Earth Day, since 1970, when we had this huge outpouring of, 20 million Americans came out of the street on Earth Day. The Cuyahoga River was burning. The Lake Erie caught fire. The peregrine falcon, eastern peregrine falcon, went extinct. We had, an oil spill that year in '69 in Santa Barbara that closed all the public beaches in Southern California. This accumulation of insults drove 20 million Americans out of the street, the largest public demonstration in American history. And the political system responded. Republicans and Democrats got together and they passed all these environmental laws, 21 environmental laws over the next 11 years. The Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, Superfund, CERCLA, RCRA, all of these other statutes that restored the public commons to the public, so that the commons, which is the air, the water, the wildlife, the fisheries, the public lands, could no longer be privatized by corporations through the mechanism of pollution, but instead they remained in the hands of the public. And that launched, in terms, a counter-revolution by industry, which began organizing all of these groups, like the Petroleum Institute and all these other groups, to dismantle that law. And they began this slow dismantlement over the next 20 years. And I was part of that battle, watching that happen.
Yeah.
But the Citizens United case just blew it up and accelerated it. And now, we find ourselves in this situation, and particularly COVID pushed us so far down that road that the American press now sees its job not to question government authority and the pronouncements of powerful officials, or rather to reinforce those, to fortify them, to be propagandists for the orthodoxies. And Congress is completely in the hands of the moneyed interests. The president is, how can you have $3 billion and not be beholden to BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street and all their sub-companies that gave you the $3 billion, and the same pharmaceutical companies, the bankers, et cetera, are running the Republican Party as well. So they really are a duopoly, and their purpose is to maintain the corporate control over our government. And I feel like what we're doing is, a genuine American revolution where we realize that we need to topple that system because it's corrupting everything that we loved about this country. It's commoditizing our landscapes, commoditizing our soil, commoditizing our children, turning us all into these, like the drones in a beehive whose, job is just to consume, to feed themselves, and to make the wealthy and elite classes to give the power to them, and to make them richer and richer with the illusion that we're hanging on to security by giving up our rights.
Yeah. The thing that has always struck me is how little accountability there's been throughout all of this. How there's no appreciation for what is being sacrificed in exchange for the gains of this small group of people. Because it's a really small group of people that we're talking about that have an enormous amount of control.
That are the beneficiaries of this.
That are the beneficiaries of this. The degree of sacrifice to me is so great that as a human who has been around that and watched it happening all around me and trying to have this conversation, how do I try? It's hard for me to understand that there's such a lack of morals in this group that they're unwilling. They would still be so vastly wealthy if they put time into looking at how, Amazon's a great example, but like, if they cared more about the health and well-being of their consumers, more than their own corporate profits, I think a lot of people ask themselves the question of how do we get through to them? How do we help them find a path towards changing course? how do we come together and say, rushing into the lab to solve issues and related to like what many are calling augmentation, right? Like how do we stop focusing on augmentation and these short-sighted gains across everything: medicine, economy, health, agriculture, geopolitics, right? How do we get away from this short-term thinking and go back to long-term focus on preservation of health and preservation of wellness? Um, there's this fork that's happening. There's one path that says, let's, engineer, let's crisis engineer everything. So that's looking at everything as like, it's too hot right now, let's engineer for rain. You have cancer, let's kill all the cancer with chemo. Obesity with Ozempic. A virus that's like a severe virus, but like let's get it with like as many vaccines as we can get. Right? That's the
Yeah,
path.
let's solve the problem of droughts by building dams.
Let's solve the problem of droughts by building dams. And it's very transactional, right? And I think this is why people are frustrated with capitalism, because capitalism incentivizes this kind of behavior. But it's capitalism does a lot of good things too. So I'm very pro capitalism, especially with ethics and long term considerations in mind. But this mode of short term thinking has gotten us into a lot of issues. It's resulted in the chemicalization of our entire agricultural system. We know that makes us sick. And then there's this other path, right? This is a path that many of us in this campaign are all aligned on. And this other path is very much, we love the science of healthy rivers. We love what that gives to the community. Protecting, the steady population of salmon in our waterways, understanding the incredible ecological engineering that nature does all on its own. How do we participate in that, both in a capitalistic economy, but doing so that results in this analysis of, maximal long-term output and sustainability. I just heard, there's this new group of they call themselves environmentalists that are unhappy with this campaign. What are they missing right now? Because I think that, we can panic engineer our way towards these short-term gains in the environment, or we can work through science to create a more resilient future for ourselves.
Yeah, and I love that idea that we can either have, which is your idea, we can either have an augmented future or we can have a future which is in concert with nature, where we recognize that we're part of it and that, and use the engineering that God gave us and evolution gave us to maximize our lives and maximize our happiness and effectiveness and abundance. And, it's an illusion. The augmented future is an illusion. It's like all, Upton Sinclair made this very useful observation that a man, it's very difficult to convince a man of a fact if the existence of that fact will diminish his salary. And so ultimately, that's just an observation that people act on perceived self-interest. And as you point out, oftentimes the perceived self-interest is short-term. And it's not, long-term. Henry Ford, who is not, who did a lot of bad things in his life, one of the really important things that he did is he paid his workers fairly. and he paid them much more, double or triple what his competitors were paying. And when he was asked, why are you paying auto workers these much higher levels of money than you pay than anybody else does, he said, I want every one of my workers to be able to afford to own one of my cars. And that, as it turns out, made him the biggest car producer in the world. I think at one point he was producing something like 70 or 80% of the automobiles in the world. And he helped create the American middle class, and that philosophy helped create the American middle class. That wealth, when it's distributed to large groups of people, continues to amplify and to serve the benefit of society. But the short-term perspective it feeds this idea of engineering solutions. And, I saw that during my years as an environmental advocate and attorney, that the engineering, the Army Corps of Engineers became the villain from my first lawsuits. We recognize that their solutions were almost always short term. Yeah, you can engineer the Mississippi River in a way that is going to reduce annual flooding, but that annual flooding actually feeds the deltas that create the city of New Orleans. And New Orleans is now sinking, one of the great cities in our country. And Katrina was just, a symptom of the disease that has been created through the engineering of the Mississippi. So it's, they stopped the annual floods, but they also stop the accretions that hold the delta together, and the bird life and the fisheries and the city of New Orleans are all disappearing now because of that engineering solution. And I saw this again and again across the country, that all the dams that were created that helped to energize the West, that they were short-term solutions that are now the agents of drought and destruction in those landscapes. And when I switched over to human health, I saw the same thing. I saw people like Bill Gates make this argument that the only path to human health is through a syringe, and human beings have existed for very long periods of time on all these continents without that, and there was a wisdom that we've seemed to have forgotten about, building the human immune system and building our own capacity to fend off the bad effects of viruses and bacteria, and instead of relying on an engineering technique to do that, which has all these other costs for which the industry is not held accountable. That before you introduce vaccines, you have to pass a law that says if they kill you, if they injure you, you can't sue the company. And then you have to twist the science to make sure nobody learns about all of these other impacts, what they call the adverse events, that those are disguised through a variety of mechanisms. So nobody can really make a cost-benefit analysis about whether this product is averting more problems than it's causing. And, that's all obscured through data manipulation and through opaqueness and control of the medical journals. And I think what you and I are trying to do is to create a revolution in this country where, where real science becomes the basis of policy, and where there's transparency, where there's democracy, where science is elevated rather than money. And that, the best scientists in the world are the ones who are actually involved in a courageous and existential search for truth, rather than, pursuing the mercantile interests of the pharmaceutical industry or the food industry, or, or processed foods, whatever. And, science has been perverted. The press has been perverted. The Congress has been perverted. The entire medical industry, the hospitals we saw, the doctors during COVID, really not comporting themselves in ways that actually promoted public health.
I think that most everyone in every field you just mentioned, they're not trying to hurt anyone. They want to live up to their duty. They want, like journalists want to live up to their duty of, the free press. Um, and I still meet these individuals. They're people. These are individual, people with independent agency who are, started their career from a place of wanting the truth. Um, and I actually have engagements with journalists frequently that will share things with me about their own concerns about what has happened to these for-profit news platforms. But the people themselves, and this is what I want to remind everyone, um, every opportunity I have, is that you don't need to lose your sense of agency. You are an individual. Just because your organization is going one direction doesn't mean you have to too. And that's the great beauty of this country. And of course, it's made harder if you risk losing your job, or you miss lose income for your family. But I think that there's a lot of strength in that middle zone. And my goal for us is to reach that portion of America, those doctors who might be too afraid to speak up, and let them know that there are safe forums to do so that don't sacrifice your livelihood, right? And that's a very powerful message for us, I think, to get out right now, is that it's not all tech workers are bad, or all people of the press are doing bad things, or all doctors have let us down. Everyone was manipulated in some way or another over the last several years, and certainly during COVID. It was the greatest manipulation campaign ever in human history, likely. The Where we are right now in this moment in 2024 is a real opportunity to move on with dignity, and move on with all of the things that we have done right in our careers and our lives, and get a chance to live up to the duty that we set out to live up to when we pick these jobs. In practice, I think that really looks like, connect with other members in this community, right? Connect with people and have a conversation. Don't feel pressured to do what your party is doing. Don't feel pressured to do what your organization is doing, but have faith in this moment that it's okay if you made a mistake back then. Right? And I think that's the grace that we want to offer ourselves, each other. It's the grace I've given myself. I made many mistakes, trusting that the narrative being sold during COVID was honest, was an honest narrative. I was first in line for the mRNA vaccine. I vaccinated my daughter as early as possible. I believed it was what was in the best interest, because that's what I was being told by all of the quote experts at the time, because all other opinions were being censored, I now realize. But here we are in this moment to reset. We so desperately need to reset. And what that, I think, means is not necessarily blaming and spitting hate at everybody else. I mean, we can definitely hold people accountable. You've always done an incredible job with this, outlining, who had significant conflict of interest, who manipulated whom in that story, and you've called people out correctly. I've been going through what you've said and verifying to the best of my ability. And you have been very, very accurate in your assessment of what went wrong and why. Moving forward, we've talked about this idea of giving both parties a chance to settle their disputes, stop dragging each other through court. If you win this election, it really is the best opportunity to cool off, right? The Republican Party, those around Trump, part of the reason they're so up in arms is because the DNC has been so up in arms against them. You offer a cooling off period. 4 years of your presidency could result in probably the most important resetting of priorities across the board. How do we make this more clear to everyone that the solution to our greatest divide is a presidency that no longer spits hate at any single group?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Even, the people in some of the corporations that I consider the worst, the majority of them are just good people. The people, hedge fund managers and bankers and people in the, who work for Peabody Coal and Massey Coal and Consul. Most of them see themselves as good people. They live moral lives. They're trying to raise their families. They're trying to create employment. And I think we have to acknowledge that, and we have to avoid demonizing people. We do hold people accountable, but in ways that are positive and that we can go forward. I think the key thing that you and I need to do as soon as we get into office is to stop all the lying. Prior to when my uncle was president, 80% of the American people believed that the government always told them the truth. And we need to get back to that. And we're not going to get back to that by telling people that the government is telling you the truth and gaslighting them. We need to acknowledge that today, almost everything the government tells us is a lie. And it's manipulated information. It's never exactly the truth. And that we need to end that. We need to just, and we can do that through executive orders. We can do it through cultural changes at the agency. We can do it through personnel changes and many, many other ways. But we're going to do that, and we're going to do it by setting an example to Americans of we're going to tell the truth now. And then we're going to try to debate policy in a way that's civil. And that is not, filled with vituperation and acrimony and vilification and demonization. And, I think we can dramatically change the direction of our country. We're going to go through crises. And we could hit very grave crisis, the debt crisis. It's hard to see. And you and I spent a lot of time talking about it today, about how do we get out of that. And it's not a clear path, but America has the resilience. How do we get out of the soil and the food crisis? How do we get out of the chronic disease crisis?
And geopolitical crises.
All of these things. But, we can do it if we work together. We have America has done, the worst at destroying its soils, and our agricultural policy is the worst in the world. We have 1,000 ingredients now in our food that are illegal in Europe. We have the sickest people in the world, but we have the best doctors in this country. And that's not saying that is not, you get these politicians up there all the time and say America has the best of this, the best of this. We actually do have the best people in regenerative agriculture in this country, the most innovative farming techniques, people who are revolutionizing agriculture. It's happening here. People who are doctors, physicians who are revolutionizing medicine, regenerative or functional medicine, integrative medicine. It's happening here. It's happening elsewhere too, but they're nothing like what is happening in this country. We have the best entrepreneurs in this country. The highest concentration of entrepreneurial activity of any nation in the world, and everybody recognizes that. So we have the path out of these crises, and we have the national character to be able to of resilience. But we need to give those assets a chance to blossom and to put down roots to grow, and we need to encourage them and incentivize them and reward them. And we start doing that by just telling the truth and being honest, and then talking to people and respecting different points of view, and setting a course through collaborative democracy.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm really grateful for this opportunity to talk to you, and I look forward to many more conversations like this in the
Yeah.
future.